Well, for so many years, we've worked on Babylon Berlin, and we swam, if you will, through a time that was really way there in the past, and that we watched through the eyes of our grandparents. And I found it very interesting to look through the eyes of my imaginary grandparents and to experience these historical changes. But then, of course, I mean, what happened too is, and this is something that we could not foresee, is that there was this increasing symmetry, between the things that we reported on from a time that had been that was so far in the past, and the things that were happening here in our society, socially, politically. And then I felt this pressure rising and growing in me. I thought, well, that was the topic for my grandparents, but now, of course, there are similarities that many people also try to talk about. But of course, the people are different now. We are no longer our grandparents, and our children are much less like our grandparents. And I mean, our children, I mean, not everyone's children, but the generation that I'm talking about, that this film is talking about, those youngsters are almost young adults themselves, and it's really different as to how we encounter these topics today. And I wanted to give that a voice because I thought that there were stories that were really not, being told enough. I mean, there is this tendency currently of people isolating themselves, and I thought that this microcosm really showed that clearly. Everyone was in their own, fish tank. They built their own fish tanks, put their heads in there, and they're in direct vicinity. Everything is nice, but no one is even talking to each other any longer. It's like they have their heads underwater. But then there is this energy that comes from the outside, gets them out of their fish tanks, allows them to get closer to each other again. And that's the movement in this microcosm that we also have at the macrocosmic level, politically speaking, that, also with a view to our longings and our desires to the world. And that is the only way, I think, how we can really deal with the problems that we are currently faced with. Okay, so this is my effort to, how I try to answer your question about the controversy. The second question related to the city of Berlin. Well, Berlin, to me, is just the greatest cinema city in the world, because it is just a city that is unfinished, and it is really doing its best to never be a finished city. As soon as it looks like things are done, then you get another 2,000 construction sites on top, and there are grotesquely ugly things that are built next to wonderful buildings, and you ask yourself, whoever approved that? But at the same time, things are happening, and and you also quite happy that not all the things work out in this city, because there is a lot of movement, and sometimes, it's vexing, annoying, but, it's the city that you live in, that you talk in, that you fight in, that and I mean, this, what is originally negative, a mismanagement in city planning and architecture, is something that I secretly actually like, because I've got the feeling that once it's finished, you've got something standing there, and it looks noble and polished, and that you can tell by watching movies that play in cities that are perfect, But in Berlin, everything looks as if it's almost dilapidating again, and it's just being, repaired shoddily. And this is the kind of interim state that you can really use very nicely for filming, because sometimes you find a corner in the city that looks beautiful, and 5 meters down the road, you've got the wrecking ball flying around. I just recently saw a construction site of a construction site. So they repaired a construction site, basically. Because, they had this construction site for such a long time at the same spot that they thought they'd have to repair a few things. Did you take a picture there? Could you take a picture? No, not really. But that would have been a very typical picture of Berlin. Okay, and at the same time, the rain, as I said, Berlin is in a constant state of confusion, and the rain was very helpful, because the rain, and that's the crazy thing, you can put two people in the street, and it's not a very intimate space, because it's out there in the public, but the rain would build an acoustic zone around them, but something like an invisible wall around them as well, that makes it so cozy between them. But of course, it's not cozy for shooting a movie in those conditions. Everyone was always soaked to the bones, including me. But, you know, it creates this kind of bizarre proximity. You know, I mean, when you're shooting a film in the rain, you have to use 5 times the amount of your regular rain so as to make it look like it's really raining. And it's also very loud, so sometimes people have dialogues and they don't even understand each other. I remember, Lars, we had one scene where no one really understood the other one, and you would actually read the other person's emotions from their lips and then play accordingly. But it really creates a sense of proximity. You know, people feel like they're close to each other, although they're in this huge city. Great effect. I mean, it's also happening in the movie, and we also talked about that yesterday, the dysfunctional family. I think it's just such an interesting term, because it is a term that, you know, makes you try to distance yourself from that. And it also allows you to imagine that there's something like a functional family. Well, I'd say it's only machines that always function. Human beings don't function, and that is what turns them into human beings. And if we ever can make our peace with that, with these contradictions, just like Bertolt Brecht said, he said contradictions represent hope. Well, if we can make our peace with that, we could make major progress, because our societies right now are ailing because of these categories of good and bad and wrong and right and black and white and right and left, because it's a kind of a black and white thinking that in psychology is known as cognitive distortion and basically madness. You know, to just think in black and white, you know, to have these kinds of extreme thoughts is a symptom of a borderline disorder, for example. And the very fact that we are now always called upon to have a very clear position, to position ourselves, you know, unambiguously, and that we're always forced to, you know, look at complex situations and try to package them in posts and tweets that always lack the necessary depth and complexity. They have to undermine this complexity, and that means that we always run the risk to think along these extreme lines and to just admit to ourselves that we are flawed beings, ambivalent beings that can make mistakes, and whose most dominant characteristic is that we are contradictive, you know. And to be able to live with that would be an enormously important step. And interestingly, in the movie, we as parents are being confronted with that by our children. So they confront us with our own contradictions. And that is a point where I think, well, it just goes to show how courageous it is of a filmmaker to present himself in, you know, your own flawed state, and that this really opens up a great opportunity. And that's why, you know, I was really happy after a certain time that we will be in the opening movie. You know, first I was a bit sad that we were not part of the competition, but I really think that this film has the potential to be important for these debates that we're dealing with every day. And I would claim that, you know, everyone feels the same in the respect that, you know, there is no single day where you're not called upon to, you know, position yourself with a view to what's happening politically, and, you know, and to use this film as a starting point to not just enter into the debates in order to be able to say, well, this one's right and that one's not right, but to perhaps even find something that allows us to live with this contradiction and that both parties might be right. That is, I think, also the objective of a festival like this.